So welcome everyone. My name is Paloma Rago. I'm a faculty at the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University, and I teach mainly in the programs of philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. Let me welcome you today, but before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded territory, Algonquin territory, and it's important for us to acknowledge the traditional custodian of this land. And welcome to this event. We are in a lovely venue tonight. The Global Center for Pluralism is a nonprofit international organization dedicated to advancing diversity worldwide. I can't think of a better venue, the most important venue in light of the challenges and the changes happening today in the world. Fun fact, this building used to be the home of the Dominion Archives of Canada, as well as the War Museum. Let me tell you just a little about Carleton University and the PhilanthroTHINK series. So on a regular basis now for 5 years, we've been holding these in partnership with several partners, these series of public talks ranging from public policy in the sector, data, faith-based philanthropy. So we really have a lot of topics. And today, this is our 20th public engagement, not just in the philanthropy series, but just as in general. So we are really, really happy that you came today. In the last 5 years, Carleton University's graduate program in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership has achieved great reputation. And to this date, we have 71 graduates in our program. So we're very, very proud of that. Our graduates come from across Canada. Some really new to the sector, some with years of experience. And so we really benefit from this diversity within our ranks. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this talk, and on behalf of my colleague at Carleton and others, we would like to also thank the sponsors for this really incredible evening. So first, powered by data, the Philanthropist, Imagine Canada, the Lawson Foundation, Max Bell Foundation, Maytree, and the Mootard Foundation. So it's really thanks to the people involved and everyone that we are able to come together as a community and discuss about these important issues. I will ask Brittany who is our moderator, to introduce our panelists. And so thank you.
All right. So hello everyone, as Paloma said, my name is Brittany Fritsch. I'm the Manager of Public Policy at Imagine Canada and will be moderating the event. But before I introduce the speakers, I wanted to set the context a little bit. So the title of our event is Starting Fresh, Imagining a Nonprofit Policy Environment for 2017 Onward. So charities and nonprofits, as you know, are at the forefront of meeting needs in our communities, whether it's addressing the social, economic, or environmental injustices, or providing cultural, spiritual, and recreational opportunities. That's what we do. That's what we have done for a long time. There's a growing recognition that the nature of the issues we're tackling today demand a different type of response. Issues like rising income inequality, precarious work, the effects of the gig economy and automation on our workforce, the effects of climate change, the opioid crisis, reconciliation, the list could go on. These issues are increasingly complex and interconnected. Their solutions and causes are linked to each other in ways that are sometimes not obvious. So what this means is that no individual organization, no charity, no nonprofit, or even subsector, or government for that matter, is able to make a dent in these issues on their own. While the issues, though, that we're addressing have become increasingly complex and have changed, the systems that are governing us have not changed. Our laws date back to the 1600s and have changed very little since then. The governing systems define how we do our work and also the way that we relate to each other, the way that we interact with citizens, with governments at all levels, other charities in the private sector. So does Canada's current legal, regulatory, and policy environment sufficiently enable us to do the work that we do and meet the demands of the 21st century? And if not, what would need to change? And that's what we're hoping to talk about today. Many of you are here as participants of Imagine Canada's Charities Day on the Hill, which is happening tomorrow. And for those of you who don't know what the Day on the Hill is, Charities Day on the Hill brings together 40 leaders from charities across Canada to advocate on behalf of the sector on issues like the need for legal regulatory reform, social innovation, and data. And it's an interesting time to be having these conversations, not just tomorrow for Hill Day, but for charities and nonprofits in general. It's really the first time in over a decade that we've been able to have these conversations with government. And there's a number of avenues that these conversations are happening. So just to give you some background, the Prime Minister's mandate letter to the Minister of Justice instructed her to work with both the Ministers of Finance and Minister of National Revenue to develop a modernized regulatory and legal framework for the charitable nonprofit sector. Last year, CRA consulted on political activities, and the consultation panel, which advised CRA, recommended that the Income Tax Act be amended to focus on charitable purposes rather than activities. This would be a very fundamental and significant reform were to happen. There's currently a motion in the Senate to strike a special committee to study the charitable nonprofit sector. Now, Senate studies have a reputation for being very thorough, less political than studies in the House, and can often lead to significant reform. And of course, the government is currently consulting on a social finance and social innovation strategy, which could have significant impacts on our governing systems. Together, these activities have created a window of opportunity for us to have these collective conversations and ultimately to reimagine a policy environment. Tonight's panelists bring diverse perspectives from their experiences on the ground regarding how legal policy and regulatory regimes could be better designed to address Canada's current and anticipated needs. And just a quick note to say that some of the time we're going to be talking about the systems that affect both charities and nonprofits, and others are going to be talking about the systems that affect charities and just nonprofits, and we'll try to be clear, but they often get conflated and confusing. That's why we're here. All right, so directly to my left is Darcy Penner. He is the Social Enterprise Manager for the Canadian Community Economic Development Network in Manitoba. CCEDNet is a member network of nonprofits, cooperatives, and social enterprises. Darcy's work focuses on creating a supportive policy environment for social enterprise development and growth. This includes being the project manager for the Manitoba Social Enterprise Strategy, a partnership with CCEDNet and the province of Manitoba. And Darcy is also the chair of the Jubilee Fund, a nonprofit charitable loan fund that supports poverty reduction initiatives and accessing financing. Monika Dutt is the executive director of the national organization Upstream, a movement to create a healthy society through evidence-based, people-centered ideas. She is the past chair of Canadian Doctors for Medicare, an organization focused on accessible, high-quality, publicly funded healthcare in Canada. She's also a family doctor in Nova Scotia and was a medical officer of health in 3 different provinces. Yancy Craig is originally from Hamilton, Ontario. Yancy is a mixed heritage European and Oneida from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Yancy is currently working at the Assembly of First Nations as a senior policy advisor and has a background in Indigenous community development within government and community organizations. He was also formerly the director of strategy development at the National Association of Friendship Centers and formerly on the board of Apathy. Finally, we have Anna Gilchrist, who is a journalist and citizen engagement specialist based in Victoria, BC. She's currently editor-in-chief at DeSmog Canada, a nonprofit online news magazine dedicated to making complex energy and environment news accessible to Canadians. DeSmog's reporting has sparked coverage by the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, CBC, and is currently a finalist for 2 Canadian online publishing awards. Prior to joining DeSmog, Emma was communications director for BC's largest democracy group, Dogwood. And Emma has a degree in journalism, has worked as a reporter and editor in Canada and the UK, including stints at Cambridge Evening News, Calgary Sun, and Calgary Herald. So before we get into the discussion portion, I'd ask each of the panelists to describe a little bit about the work that they do and what they want to contribute to the conference.
Firing off right away?
You're firing off right away.
I just noticed how cool Monika's shoes are. I don't know why I'm about to talk. I'm going to be staring down the whole time. Okay, but I'm going to turn this on so I kind of know where I am in terms of the time frame I'm supposed to keep to. Thank you all very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be able to speak and share some ideas of the work that we're doing in Manitoba and in Winnipeg, and hopefully it'll be of some value to the conversation that you're having here over today and tomorrow related to the topic. So again, my name is Darcy Penner. I am the policy manager for the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, which is a national network in the Winnipeg office dealing with the Manitoba membership. And our membership comprises of organizations that are dealing with the topics that we think are necessary and the practices we think that are necessary for inclusive and sustainable communities as well as economies, with a significant economic bent to the work that we're doing and a significant poverty reduction bent to it out of necessity of working out of Manitoba, sort of dealing with a lot of the colonial fallout from this, kind of concentrates Canada's challenge, quite concentrates in the prairies a fair amount. So that's a big reality of what the work that we're doing there is, and so poverty reduction has a really big bent to it. And it's interesting talking here because the topics that we're dealing with for organizations range from food security, access to childcare, access to affordable housing, community-oriented education programs, hiring folks with barriers to employment, training them. The range of the gamut of those organizations, we do not necessarily come together or identify as a sector related to the corporation status. So the conversations that are sort of the charitable sector and the nonprofit sector are a little bit foreign to our membership and not the way that we're sort of conversing with ourselves. It's more so, what is the challenge you're facing? Which of these mechanisms will let you get the job done easiest? What are the advantages and disadvantages that come from that? And you select from there. So as a consequence, our members are nonprofits, our members are for-profits, our members are cooperatives, nonprofit or for-profit cooperative, some of whom have charitable status, some who don't. So when you said we should be concerned about not conflating, I'm going to conflate all of it at one time because there's really not that much distinction. One of our best social enterprises operating in Manitoba is a for-profit social enterprise owned by two nonprofits. They created a sub-entity that's now, they own that, and that's where they're doing their work when it comes to running a full-service food kitchen and hiring folks with barriers to employment to do that. Some of the creative solutions that we're sort of working with the existing regulatory regime, but definitely they couldn't care less what the actual incorporation status is. They just kind of want to get the job done. So the rules impact it, but we don't quite come around that way. And so when thinking about some of the big questions, some of the bold questions, changes, I would kind of want to focus a little bit, like switch immediately to a little bit more operational piece that can work. And that is, we're asking the question not about what happens after money, what is government's role after money has been accumulated into places and then is granted out and then is put into activities. Well, a lot of our focus is how do we hardwire some of the outcomes that we're looking to achieve right into government functions across the board. And the easiest place to look at that is the practice of procurement. This is not necessarily where we would expect these social outcomes or community or environmental impact to occur, or a place for us actually to have a policy directive in, but it's one of our most successful places, at least in Manitoba, when it comes to finding dovetails of what the government wants to see in terms of policy and what they can do to promote that outcome and to promote that goal. So we have Manitoba Housing right now in Manitoba. It's a Crown corporation that's responsible for our social and affordable housing, whether it's owning assets or providing the subsidies. They do $7 million worth of work in their ongoing renovations and ongoing apartment turnovers. That much work, they do way more than that. $7 million of that is targeted specifically at social enterprises, explicitly for the purpose of hiring folks with barriers to employment, getting them trained, either providing a long-term employment place or setting up a ladder or springboard to put folks into the private sector afterwards. That's an instance of where we see where we think the biggest priority, or one of our biggest priorities for government should be. And then coming up from that, some of the interesting pieces that have come from that for the realities for the organizations that are our members. One of them, Manitoba Green Retrofit, they're a nonprofit organization that's doing all fee-for-service work, but they want to access equity investment because they can't get access to capital well enough through existing structures. They have too little security. The Jubilee Fund, we actually provide them security, but it takes a charity over here to be able to let them access security by putting up a loan guarantee. So they're looking at creating a for-profit subsidiary that would sit beneath them for the purpose of them being able to access equity, and then they would continue to do the exact same work, only they would be able to take investments on that. So that's sort of where the intersection comes for our membership when it comes to government structure, great concept like procurement, goes down, organizations doing the work, but now have struggling to find access to capital so that they can keep up with the workflow, so they can handle cash flow that's now going to consider a different incorporation status. So we come to the same point that we're talking about, but we kind of get there a little bit differently. And I'm at 5 minutes and 20 seconds. So when it comes to devising what we look at, where we're going to be going forward with some of this, so looking specifically at some questions around revenues, questions around surpluses, questions around incorporation types that might allow a hybrid, allowing some equity investment but still community control, maybe still the asset block applies to a good chunk of it. The overarching theme that we're interested in seeing in from our membership is that it's done in a co-created process, that it's done similar to how we did the social enterprise strategy in Manitoba. It was half government, half community. Community is responsible for its implementation, and it's guided by a steering committee comprised of both the government and the nonprofit organizations and the sectors. And it's the tack that's being taken right now with the social innovation and social finance strategy. And we'll see how that comes out at the back end. But we're quite supportive of that approach. And we'd like to see in the solving of these questions, when asking all these questions, really emphasizing the role that co-creation can have to getting to policy outcomes that are shared by both government and by the community stakeholders.
I have to point out Darcy has very cool socks, so with bicycles on it, and my heart is beating really fast, and I dropped my phone, so I can't look at it. It's be really awkward to bend backwards and get it, so just yell at me over time. So it's really an honor to be part of this panel of very knowledgeable people, and I felt like I wanted to give my caveat just to say I'm fairly new to being in a management role as an executive director of a nonprofit. Being on a board is, you think you understand an organization, and then you get into this role and realize that it's hard work. You have to keep a lot of things in the air. So just putting that out there. I like to start with stories. So as Brittany mentioned, I'm a family doctor also, and I work in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, which you might know is a very beautiful place, but it's also a place where 30% of kids who are under the age of 6 are living in poverty. And so I see patients as a family doctor, and I wanted to talk about one particular patient, and I'll call him Adam. And he's a teenager who, his father works out west in Alberta, but with the changes in the economy has had far less work out west, and so his work is quite sporadic, and thus is his drug coverage for the family. And Adam has type 1 diabetes, which is something that can typically be fairly well controlled with medications. But lately he's been coming in because he's been in a crisis. He's been in hospital because of uncontrolled diabetes, or he's run out of insulin, their family is struggling to pay for it. He's looking, or his mother's looking for samples, which is a really bad way to give anyone medication. And so it really makes me think about the fact that, yes, he has diabetes and he does get ill with diabetes, but that isn't his main health issue. His main health issue is his father's precarious work, or their lack of drug coverage, or the fact that now they're living near poverty. And so that kind of drives the idea of Upstream, which is the organization I'm the ED of now, and it's that idea that you can take any health issue and look upstream from that health issue and see the economic, the social, the environmental policies that could have prevented those health issues or better controlled them, rather than looking downstream and dealing with Band-Aid solutions like dealing with hospital care or even most of the time in a family doctor's office. So Upstream is an organization that has quite a broad mandate, that we want to make that connection between health issues and all these broader policy issues. And we do that in a number of ways. One is through storytelling. So we try to use a range of different media in an innovative way, through podcasts, through blogs, through infographics, through a number of different social media platforms to tell that story, to have people understand that connection. We also have a policy advocacy and research area, which we've largely focused on income in our first few years, knowing that income is one of the greatest determinants of whether you are healthy or not. And then we also have events. We have a conference that we've had for 2 years in Ottawa. We have smaller events across the country that are just ways to generate energy and interest and to bring kind of local movement building into our organization. And so my path to Upstream has been through medicine. I am a family doctor. I'm also a specialist in public health and preventive medicine, which is a mouthful, and I'll shorten that to PHPM. And the idea of public health and preventive medicine is we see the community as a patient as opposed to just the individual. And so we try to take actions that will have an impact across a community, that will improve the health at a community level, and ideally at the individual level also, but that's the level at which we're thinking. And as I mentioned, I've worked in different parts of the country in this formal public health setting as a medical officer of health, which is someone who works with a health authority or a public health unit. And there's many aspects I loved about working in kind of a formal public health system. And one of them has been the close relationship you often have with nonprofits and charities in your community. And I'm sure probably many of you have worked with your local public health people. It could be we're collaborating on an issue together, and other times you might be helping to support the work of the nonprofit or the charity, for example, by providing data or information that can help them with their efforts. And often with their kind of nimbleness and innovation and creativity, they can help to forward goals that we're all trying to reach together, but we have different means by which we can do that. But that leads to why I wanted to jump into the nonprofit world, because as probably lots of you know too, working in a health authority or any kind of larger institution can also be very frustrating when you're waiting a year for your Facebook page to be approved, or begging for access to Twitter, or having your media releases vetted by 50 people before they can go out. I wanted to work in an area that may have less resources, at least in a startup, but has some of the nimbleness that I wasn't having in the public health environment. So that's why I started in this role in April. And in terms of speaking to some of the challenges that I've seen so far that are relevant to this panel, the two that I wanted to talk about is one, of course, being fundraising, and I know that's an issue in general for everybody. And the challenge of being a charity and not a challenge of being a nonprofit and not being able to access charitable donations. Like many nonprofits, we have tried to find ways to work with that situation and work with another charity to be able to facilitate having the option of donations, charitable donations. And I've been in two organizations now that we've had very good partnerships where we've together developed goals that we want to further and had products that we put out together, and then as the nonprofit we had a channel through which we could direct donations to be able to be charitable donations. But again, as probably lots of you know, it's a very cumbersome process at times. It can be a challenge for the charity as well as for the nonprofit, because we may not be a high priority for the charity. So one idea is, can we look at a way for startup nonprofits to be able to access charitable donations in a way that is, regulated, in a way that has criteria, but that allows that initial startup without having to create all these structures that don't really make sense, but are done because we just have to find a way to do it. The second piece I wanted to talk about is that clearly our mandate is around prevention, and so as we're looking at whether to become a charity, that's been an ongoing discussion. And prevention is something that often charities are not able to do, and that's kind of the reason for our being. And so when we looked at definitions, we could fit under the health-related definitions do not apply with this different view of health, looking at how do we look at policies impacting health as opposed to how do we deliver healthcare services, which is not what we do at all. So that the definitions around health are narrow, are outdated, and they are downstream as opposed to being upstream. So if we could change that definition of health, as we're doing in public health, as we're doing in healthcare, to acknowledge the fact that health is far more than just the delivery of service, which is, I don't want to belittle that because that's super important, but that doesn't take into account some of the ways in which we can most have an impact on health. So that would be kind of another idea that I would throw, that can we change our concept of health. And then the other piece of that I think is important to bring in is the data piece, that we know that it's not just people living, say, in poverty that are at greatest risk of poor health, although they are, if there's a whole gradient. So as you say, start out with the wealthiest people, as you go down that rung of wealth, you are less and less healthy all the way down. So if we can think of it more as a gradient as opposed to only the cutoff and only working with a certain group, we can maybe better expand that definition of health and help create a new definition for how nonprofits can achieve that charitable status.
Thank you. Going through it is good. So I'm Yancy Craig, and I'm going to take a bit of a different approach. I'm not going to speak from the current speak on behalf of the Assembly First Nations and presentation today, and we won't do that. What I want to speak to you about is my own experience and discuss a little bit about the opportunity space in the social innovation, social enterprise realms, not-for-profit sector, engaging with Indigenous communities. Before I do that, I would like to once again acknowledge the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We're gathered here this evening. I'm very honored to be living in the Algonquin Nation's territory for the last 35 years. It's not my own, originally from southwestern Ontario. I think it's an important acknowledgement, and I think that's a good starting point. When we were having conversations about how the panel would unfold, I swore I wasn't going to speak about reconciliation, but then that's just a big lie. I think, I think we're in the era of reconciliation, so that's kind of, I want to provide a bit of a perspective on reconciliation. I would also like to say it's very nice to see some friendly faces in the room. So that's kind of a nice context for me, and I really appreciate that. What I also want to talk about is I think if I look at it and I kind of ask the room, it seems to me, in my work, that some of the most significant social issues and that we're trying to address have Indigenous people at their core impact. In the context of health, broadly speaking, as a generalization, Indigenous people suffer far worse health outcomes than the Canadian average, experience poverty, overcrowded in housing, virtually any social indicator, health indicator, economic indicator. Indigenous people, they say, as an average, perform less well. Many of you in the room are trying to address these issues. A lot of charities, not-for-profits, large networks of organizations are trying to address those issues. And so I give it to you up and thank you for that experience and that work. So part of the challenge, I think part of the discussion in the context of this evening's conversation is about how to activate the not-for-profit sector. How to be innovative? How do you create those relationships? Which brings me back to that wonderful word reconciliation. Of course, I think we think of ourselves after the Truth and Reconciliations report in 2015 as living in the era of reconciliation. So what is that going to mean for us? At its heart, I've been very fortunate to know the three commissioners of the TRC, and they talk about reconciliation being about mending strained or frayed relationships. So how can elements in them do that? And I think part of how we can do that, particularly in an Indigenous context, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, urban, is to try to understand the realities of people with whom we're dealing and the clients of those organizations, and to understand that there are barriers. I mean, we may think we speak a common language in the not-for-profit or social innovation sectors, or the charitable sector, but that may be not common language to the local First Nation, the Inuit people, the Métis, or the Indigenous community or community organization. So that takes persistence and patience and a commitment to the relationship, to my mind. So that's really, really key. If we talk about the policy, legislative, and regulatory framework, I think anything that supports flow of capital for not-for-profit and charitable organizations would then help to facilitate engagement and probably co-creation and investment with Indigenous organizations and communities. I think another important thing to consider in the context of First Nations on reserve is that First Nations are governments. So they have a lot of things that they're seeking to do, a lot of responsibility. They also don't have a lot of flexibility in the context of it. So we talked a lot about how to innovate to address poor social outcomes. Well, we have the Indian Act and other policy and legislative and regulatory regimes that are perpetuating some of the poor outcomes that we seek to innovate a broader solution to. So that's one thing I would want to talk about. But that's not, so that's part of your advocacy effort. You can advocate on behalf of a community. You can learn to engage with them. But you have to be committed to the long term, I think, is something I would talk about as well, and how to get more engaged. But it's an opportunity, I would think, for Canada. The Indigenous population is the youngest and fastest growing segment of the Canadian population. So we need to make sure that we're doing all we can across the sector, across the social, economic, and health systems to achieve better outcomes. It's in all of our collective interest as well. So I think I'm happy to, really happy to hear from the rest of the panel, and happy to have a bit of a dialogue. I really like the monologue approach. So I really appreciate being here and happy to continue the conversation.
So I'm Gilchrist from DeSmog, Canada. Also very happy to be here and hear from the other panelists. I'm just going to start with a little bit of a quote here. Some newspapers dig. Some newspapers are a constant embarrassment to the powerful. Some manage to be entertaining, provocative, and fair at the same time. There are a few such newspapers in Canada. So that statement is from a report written in 1970 by the Special Senate Committee on Mass Media. Yeah, so normally when I read that, everybody's like, well, yeah, obviously. But it was actually almost 50 years ago now that was, first surfaced. So we've been dealing with a disintegrating media in Canada now for a long time. And over the last 50 years, things have gotten much worse than they were described then. And so I run a nonprofit news organization called DeSmog Canada, and we focus on stories that aren't being told elsewhere. So we've done things like written on the movement for Indigenous protected areas, whereby Indigenous people are actually putting forward a vision of what they want to happen on their land, as opposed to all the stories we see about what Indigenous people don't want to happen on their land. Our readers have funded photographers to go take aerial photographs of mines that are out of sight, out of mind, hydro dams, all sorts of huge mega projects that are otherwise flying under the radar. We've written about fossil fuel companies who are funding university research, all these types of things that otherwise wouldn't really be covered anywhere. We have about 100,000 readers a month right now, and we have 2 staff. Our annual budget is about $300,000 a year. And we're one of a sum total of, I was really trying to count them today, but I think there's maybe 3 nonprofit news organizations in Canada. They can definitely be counted on one hand. And when you compare this to the United States, there are more than 150 nonprofit journalism outfits down there. That number is already a little bit old. The Center for Investigative Reporting, for instance, has a budget of more than $10 million and employs nearly 80 people. ProPublica operates at a similar scale. Another, called Inside Climate News, has won a Pulitzer Prize for its work. And philanthropic foundations are pouring millions into this public interest journalism. Foundations like the Knight Foundation, the Pew Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. Even some of America's large daily newspapers are converting to a nonprofit model because the old business model of journalism is falling apart. And of course, all of this is made possible because U.S. charitable law sees journalism as a charitable endeavor. And here in Canada, despite the essential public benefit of news media, Canada's charitable law does not see journalism as a charitable endeavor. This is a problem with a pretty clear solution. Since 2010 in Canada, 225 weekly newspapers have closed, 27 daily newspapers have closed, 10,000 media jobs have been lost in the last decade. A report by the Public Policy Forum called The Shattered Mirror detailed the decline in Canadian journalism And one of its recommendations was that we bring Canada's charitable laws in line with other jurisdictions to allow for nonpartisan civic function journalism. So we should do that. One other note from my experience is that oftentimes consultations about charitable law happen with those already in the charitable sector, but that overlooks the fact that those who would be most impacted by changes to definition of charity are often those who are on the fringes of the charitable sector, where I've been operating for about the last 10 years. And so when we're going to have conversations about how we might want to change charitable law, it's really important to be including nonprofits and other types of entities in those conversations, because the people who the current legal and regulatory environment aren't working for have fled the charitable sector or never gone there in the first place because it doesn't allow us in that space.
Great point, Emma. That leads me into my first question, which is, what is something you dream of doing in your organization? And what are, if there are any, what are the barriers you would perceive that you are facing to meet that dream? Maybe Emma, because you ended on that note, you can start on that note.
So I dream of building a really strong cross-Canada independent environmental news network that fills the gaps that are being left by legacy media. And the barrier to that is funding. The barrier to that is being able to, I think there's a couple ways forward. So there are definitely some encouraging examples from around the world of reader-funded journalism, like The Correspondent in the Netherlands, for instance, even The Guardian now. The Guardian has 250,000 paying members, not subscribers, just people who optionally pay like $7 a month for Guardian journalism. So there is some potential there for sure. But when you look at how we're operating versus how groups in the U.S. can operate, where there are huge grants available for journalism, that's a major barrier, especially in the startup phase. And Canada's media landscape right now is pretty barren. Like in the independent news media, there's very few of us. Even if you expand the scope outside of nonprofit, so then you could include like the Tyee and the National Observer and Ricochet, but you would still be counting them on 1 to 2 hands kind of thing. And I think it's really behooves the philanthropists to find a way to fund journalism, because journalism is so essential to every to the entire functioning of our democracy. And if we aren't very careful, we're going to end up with a huge vacuum.
I was slightly concerned that we were going to be just going to be funding. When it came to how we were going to be a barrier to achieving all of our dreams, and that is still probably it. But I'll focus in on one of the challenges that a lot of organizations do work with is related to the stability and the predictability of the funding environment. But in particular, for those organizations that are engaging in market activity, clarity around revenues and surpluses could bring forward quite a bit of more, I don't know if the right word is entrepreneurialism, but that gets used for everything, so although innovative entrepreneurialism, that is what it will bring forward. Allowing organizations to dabble in those areas, to find market niches and to go after them when there's a significant social impact that can come with them, and to find an environmental impact that can come with that. And to be able to have, we have the amount that we struggle with as an organization of just educating boards who've been in this place for, say, 30 years. Generally, your board tends to be folks who are later in their careers. And if we think that the laws surrounding nonprofit and charity regulations are old and rooted, these folks went through that, are in it, and that is how it works. And so we miss a bunch of opportunities because there isn't clarity when it comes to surpluses and revenues and what organizations can do in terms of going onto the market. And even if there is clarity, there's not enough to give conviction at a board level, at a cultural level, that they're going to permit this type of work to go on beneath them. So we think that if we would open that up a little bit, and that's not even going towards pushing for new incorporation statuses, this is sort of just clarifying what we've got right now, would make a lot more certainty on governance side of things, and I think allow some of the leaders of organizations of our social enterprises to find more opportunities.
volunteering.
Yeah.
Tell us. I guess my dream would be that idea that health is the factor that's considered in policy decision-making at various levels of government. And it's more than just kind of a conceptual idea. There's very practical ways in which it's been applied. Quebec has it embedded into their legislation. It's been done at national levels in other countries. It's been done locally in different parts of Canada. And it means when you're making a policy, a major policy decision, you have a list of different areas that you need to think about related to health in a broad sense. So from the specifics of how does it affect certain health conditions to how does it affect community cohesion, how does it affect even voting practices in an area. So it can be a range of different aspects connected to health, and that analysis is done. And so my dream would be that would be a way in which governments are doing that. And from a public health perspective, it has been applied. Some people might know that the former chief medical officer of health in New Brunswick recently did a report on hydraulic fracturing, and it's a wonderful example of looking at health in a very broad sense, from employment as a health issue, from education as a health issue, how hydraulic fracturing might impact those different areas. So I would love to see that be part of decision-making across sectors and within government. And then, of course, the barrier to that is anything that requires kind of being embedded into government practice is going to be, a long process involving multiple areas, multiple departments, working with, different, whether it's ministers or different people involved in administration. So it's the barrier of just trying to make a major cultural change, both within the general population, but definitely within kind of government levels. And I think sometimes municipal governments are some of the best places to get some of this started. And we've been working with a few different entities at different government levels. But if we can embed that more and more in practice, I think it'll become more of a norm across Canada, and it would really benefit health across a much broader group of people beyond what healthcare traditionally looks like.
Yancy.
Oh, goodness. I have several thoughts. I think one of my key thoughts is, in my dreams for Canada, for us as a country, is to take a step forward in faith in this era of reconciliation to assist the country, our institutions, and First Nations, Métis, and individuals to continue to decolonize and reculturalize our country, and to reverse the impact of colonization on socioeconomic and health indicators and outcomes for some of our more vulnerable citizens. That's a lofty systemic goal that one small legislative or regulatory change may not be able to address. But I think we're getting there. I think we're starting to see some recognition that there are a lot more players involved in the federal governments. We don't see it everywhere. Sometimes you raise an Indigenous issue or an opportunity to work with an Indigenous organization, and even within the government, which I have most experience, someone would suggest, well, that's, it's an Indigenous issue, so that's just for one ministry or department to deal with. So I think a more collaborative systemic approach is important, and I think something would be really helpful is for people to kind of get to know the stories of the land upon which they're settled. And I think that's important. You see that in some cities that are sort of renaming in sort of original Indigenous place names. Some projects in some cities are doing that. Some jurisdictions, municipalities, provinces, territories, and the federal government have committed to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I think is an important step. There is a philanthropic sector declaration on truth and reconciliation that many organizations signed on to. So those are our opportunities. With respect to flow of funds, some First Nations have challenges becoming qualified donors. So I think some creativity looking at the opportunities for working with nonprofits would be a helpful approach. And then I think there's a whole conversation around allyship and relationship building, but I don't pretend to talk about that in the context of answering this one.
It's a great segue to our next question. Thank you for that. So, what I wanted to ask was, what do you guys think the role of government is in fostering the charitable and nonprofit sector into the 21st century? Picking up on sort of the pieces, Yancy, that you were talking about with respect to co-creation and engagement. So maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, so what the federal government needs to do, I think, is kind of get out of the way. So I think, as a former federal public servant, I think that's always a preoccupation when you work in policy is when confronted by an opportunity or a challenge is, well, what's the appropriate federal role? And I think that's something the federal government is still figuring out relative to social innovation and social finance. And more of this work is ongoing. So I would think that that's one element of it. So creating a system and to be a little bit provocative to avoid the shiny object syndrome that can sometimes be pervasive when we talk about social innovation, social finance. Seeing some nodding heads, people have had that experience. And to, I think the opportunity is just to listen to the practitioners and to facilitate the work, and not in a way which is really about offloading other funding and other responsibilities. I would just add, to an Indigenous context, particularly in First Nations or even in Métis community context, where there is interest in pursuing social finance or social entrepreneurship, it is not meant to be, it's meant to be a supplement to fiduciary obligations, program funding, those types of things, not a replacement or an offload of those responsibilities.
Anyone?
I'll jump to the top. On picking up on some of the themes that came from, everyone sort of identified siloing of government programs. You mentioned, that's something that INAC deals with. We want help extended over there. I want to bring that back around to the scene. At one point, I'm going to be continually harping off here, but that governments create markets, pretty big markets actually, that governments manage to create through their just general operations, through the general use of their goods and services, and through the general activities that they undertake. But we also know that gaps in markets and failures of markets are what underpin, as you mentioned, health outcomes when it comes to the social determinants of health. It underpins many Indigenous issues, access to the labor market and employment outcomes. So, as an enabler of government, to take a hard look at where those challenges can be addressed with the existing spending and the existing operations that are already ongoing. Who maintains this building? And is it a job and training opportunity that can be used part with the local nonprofits so they can get folks who have very good employment to start learning these skills and potentially ladder out even move from there? Where are your cafeterias purchasing food from, and are they creating a local food economy? Are they supporting a strong food production economy? And this one example came up at dinner. One of our organizations, one of our members is Aki Energy, and they're working on an Island Lakes area, First Nations in not northern Manitoba, but similar, hard to reach Manitoba. And enormous diabetes challenge that we face in Manitoba. There's the human toll, and then there's the actual fiscal toll. It's a massive, massive problem. So some of our members have been going in there trying to do food production. Growing a food, a garden on Garden Hill, and then the raising of poultry. And the federal subsidy to try to get food prices down only applies to food that's flown in to these communities. So they're actually competing against the federal subsidy, and they can't get access to it to do food production over there. And meanwhile, suffering massively from an employment crisis as well as a diabetes crisis in that same community, and the community can't get assistance to grow its own food. So fix that, I guess.
I'd like to thank Darcy for filling in my get out of the way.
Yeah, I'll try to get over my inferiority complex and jump in. I'll channel the shoes. Okay. The other part of health and all policies is the idea of looking at which groups might be inequitably impacted by certain policies. And so whether that's racialized populations or people of certain gender identity or people of certain income levels, and maybe in contrast to the get out of the way that government can do, they can also be part of ensuring that voices are heard and people are given opportunities to enter the world of nonprofits and charities that might not otherwise be there. And I think there's people in the room who know much more about this than I do in terms of, for example, who's donating and who's helping to kind of dictate what the nonprofit and charity agenda looks like through their donations, or who are in the leadership roles. And I know nonprofit sector may be a bit more representative than some of the other areas I've worked in, like medicine or otherwise, but still there are those disparities. So can government somehow, through the kind of regulatory process or the research process that they might go through, look at using the data that is there, that people are putting together, find ways to have those voices be better heard and represented through our different, both government as well as non-government entities, and having the people who are most affected by a lot of the issues that we're probably working on be the people who are able to invest in that type of work.
I think I made it fairly clear in the first go around, but the government ought to update charitable laws to reflect modern society. We're operating off laws that were created in the late 1800s in England, with just the 4 charitable purposes, and most countries have done something to update those, or they have a system that's more reflective of modern society. The consultation panel on political activities of charities did come back with that recommendation as well, to adopt an inclusive list of charitable purposes to reflect modern society. So it's a pretty clear role for government to, update those laws to allow for a wider range of charitable activity.
Great. I'd like to open it up to you guys if you have any questions for our panelists. We have a roaming mic, which Robin will come to you. If someone's got questions, then we'll come to you.
I guess my question, when you want to get the government out of things, and you want to deal with issues of inequality and access, and you're also engaged in fundraising, who has the most money? I can think of some situations in the U.S. and certainly here, where if you look at journalistic activities, for example, they're very heavily subsidized by people like the Koch brothers. So don't we have a bit of a dilemma here? Shouldn't we have some form of government subsidy so that the people with less access to funds can get some of the things that they need to do the things that they want to do?
I feel like I agree with you in what I just said. So yeah, I think that can be a significant role of government. I'm probably more pro-politics and government, feeling very idealistic and believing in the power of what our representatives can be for in terms of representing us, and ideally being able to advance a lot of the causes that we are working on. So yeah, I agree. I think that is a significant role of government.
The Public Policy Forum report, the Mirror that I referenced earlier, also recommended a fund that would be, kind of administrative arm's length, but would involve public money through some kind of new tax mechanism to get at digital advertising revenues. And I think that is a good thing. I don't think it's necessarily either or. I think, if you look across the kind of span of philanthropic funding, there's funding from, various sides of the political spectrum, and there's definitely downfalls on either side. So I think both would be part of the answer: philanthropic support and more public funding.
I think that government should absolutely fund things. I think they should stop making decisions about interventions, and that's probably a role for the service sector. The fact that, in the public imagination, particularly in the First Nations context, there's always concerns about financial accountability when the money is so prescribed and the uses for program funding are so prescribed that the two don't really relate. So I think that, Ottawa systems and should be not designing social programs, should be transferring funds and allowing those closest to the problem and most vested in accountability to their communities to design the systems. And if there are people that are used to have expertise in designing social, economic, and health and educational interventions, they should get a chance to meet up, and the government can still foot the bill. I don't have a problem with that. Back to meeting England's fiduciary obligations. But I just think that, 100-odd years of trying this approach is not getting the outcomes we need.
You don't have to. You don't have anything to say? I think you do.
In my younger years, which is a bit silly for me to say, I would, as an undergrad, I would obviously argue that the place that this should be coming from is from the state. The public space should be the one who's doing this work and should be supporting it. Having dealt with funders before, that's one of the most difficult places to possibly deal with when it comes to actually acquiring money and using it. So you have a challenge of the prescriptive nature that comes in, which then leads to more folks turning to the route of foundations, I think, because that's where you will find a little bit less, my experience, prescriptive money, and it gives a little bit more flexibility, not having to deal with clawbacks constantly, sometimes quite punitive clawbacks that can come from there. So theoretically, yeah, I'm all on board. But then none of us actually have to tackle the question of revenues for the government. Now he's talking about taxes. And that I'm not going to do that right now. I don't have a mandate for my membership, and I'm not going to take us down that road. But someone out there, I think that conversation needs to go. We kind of separate the conversation of how we're actually going to generate revenues for all this work from how we're actually going to get it out the door. And maybe we've done ourselves a disservice by separating that. I'm not sure, and I'm maybe take it for a pint after we can chat about it more, not being taped.
Great. Are there any other questions? Great.
Yes, my name is Sydney. I'm from work for Ikita, we're an environmental organization. I'm here with the Imagine Gang, and very preoccupied with the charity reform piece. So actually I have a comment for Emma and I have a question for Monika. So Emma, if you could speak to the DeSmog, who's a nonprofit media outlet in Quebec, and tell them to cover the charities issue if they haven't, that would be great. Because I think your perspective is quite new to me. What you were saying, I think it's super interesting. I think the Devoir hasn't gotten that, so you should talk to them. We should talk to them together. Monika, I'm really interested in what you said about prevention and health not being a charitable purpose, if I understood you correctly. I mean, I think the Oxfam example of them being told that preventing poverty is not a charitable objective or purpose. I think it's a great example that I've been using a lot in trying to convince this government to change this law. And I'd like to hear more and better understand how that works with health. If you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, the Upstream example is a perfect one. So very similarly, if we know that we have, a livable income for everyone, that will prevent a whole range of different health conditions, because we know it's connected to diabetes, to heart disease, to suicide, to a whole range of things. But to say that we are advocating for a living wage and that is prevention of poor health wouldn't be acceptable. So the two angles we're trying to do is, when can we fit into a certain category, which we don't. Education might be the one kind of area, but again, in education there's problems with that definition, and that's not exactly what we do. Health, it doesn't fit that because we don't provide the direct service, which is what most people tend to think of when they think about health. So it's that idea that through having even something like climate change, so having a carbon pricing regime could be connect it in with health. I'll take actually a specific example, the shutting down of coal-fired power plants. Health was an incredibly strong voice. You know that, and so to be able to make that connection between climate change, it can sometimes be, you know, a big issue that people might not think of affecting them, but talk about your use of your asthma inhaler or needing to go to the emergency department because your COPD is acting up. That connects with people. So yet at the same time, it's hard to fit that into a charitable purpose to say that by advocating for, you know, shutting down of coal, you know, those things, you are preventing poor health, and I think that would be a hard argument to make. But if we can change that frame to say that we are looking at health conditions, we have that evidence, that research has been done, we know that it will have beneficial health outcomes, then we'd be able to make that link to say we are preventing and even alleviating. So I think you could still maybe fit into the current framework, because it is more than just preventing. But ideally, of course, you want to prevent that from happening in the first place. So it's kind of a long answer to saying, one, we either need to change the whole definition of health, or two, you know, how can we somehow fit prevention into the work that we're doing.
Hi, my name is Perry Johnson. I'm with Universities Canada. First, thank you very much. It was a great panel, and I really appreciate the different perspectives you all brought. I'm also part of the Imagine Canada Day on the Hill activities tomorrow, and your stories really help bring to life, I think, the meetings we're going to have tomorrow, because it gives me more examples to think about. I guess I wanted to make two comments. One is the point that you made about the procurement opportunities. The government is a huge buyer of services, and right now our federal government is going to be piloting a new procurement strategy to better support Canadian businesses and innovators. But I don't hear them talking about what you were saying. I hear them talking about it from the point of view of small businesses, high-tech firms, the innovation, sort of the S&T side of innovation as opposed to social innovation. So I guess I'm just encouraging those of us who are on the Hill tomorrow as part of our meetings to talk about the social innovation side of the government procurement strategy, because I think you've all illustrated why it's so important. The second point I wanted to make, and this is more on my other hat, I sit on the board of the Conversation Canada. It is also a not-for-profit journalism platform that is really trying to fill a growing void in the Canadian media landscape. So I was really struck by what you said, Emma, that I think it's a huge of importance to change the charitable laws in Canada to help provide for public interest journalism. The Conversation Canada is a new model that is really pairing academics who have something to say on various topics with professional journalists. And so they will put together an article that we have professional journalists editing, and it's on a global Creative Commons platform, so it's all for free. And it was brought to Canada about 4 months ago. It's really taking off. So if you're interested, it complements the kind of work that Emma and her team are doing in terms of getting out issues and stories that we don't hear about every day on a lot of social issues that were talked about tonight by Canadian academics who have a lot of expertise, but who are edited by journalists, so it's a very accessible form. So I'm happy to chat about it afterwards if anyone's interested.
Just in respect to the procurement conversation, it is the social outcomes in procurement is coming through in a few places. Definitely, there's been a look at like SME impacts and sort of high-tech growth. Fortunately, we can kind of join forces with those folks and crack the procurement nut together, because they are also attempting to see the procurement the lowest, fastest, cheapest and fastest. They're trying to get that opened up too, realizing that's not the highest value, and that's not the highest value to a bunch of places. So I'm pals with the local chamber on this exact topic, it's coming from different places. There are 3 federal mandate letters for the cabinet ministers that include social procurement in them. And as of this week, or last week, I'll have to excuse a brief brain fart on federal issues that primarily were provincially. But whoever is in charge of Procurement Services Canada just got in their new mandate letter to start, so I don't know if it was piloting or looking into, but social procurement is language that's inside their mandate letter now. So there is some movement, but tomorrow, please push harder and harder. Yeah.
My name is Michael Lancer from Powerway Data. It's great to hear different perspectives we've heard today, just thoughts so far. I've been working in the sector for a while, and I created a for-profit company because no one was funding the area of activities that I saw an opportunity to work in, which is around data and technology and open data specifically. And then we created a nonprofit in 2013 that's now hosted at Tide. So I have, kind of a roundabout way into the nonprofit sector. And I think that the major lesson I've seen so far is that you keep on thinking that there's people that really own a problem, and it's always that next level up. And you get there and you're like, these people don't necessarily have as much control and power and as much of a plan as I thought they did. And that's no fault to them. They're operating within their limited, circumstances and doing often a great job. So now I'm very happy because in my space there's a lot of co-creation with government. I see government as my greatest tool as a director of a nonprofit, or as a director of a nonprofit initiative hosted by Tides. I was like, well, Lisa, would you clarify that? Tides Canada, yeah. So I see government as my greatest tool, is moving them through different projects, and I imagine, it sounds like you feel the same way, that they're the biggest tool that we have. I'm wondering, for the rest of you, about your relationship with government. Does it feel like it's a productive relationship? Does it feel combative? And what are your hopes for it to be, transformative in terms of helping your organizations?
That's a great question, Michael. Who wants to kick that off? Yeah.
I'll jump in on that one, and again, for more of an observing type of perspective rather than, although I work with federal government every day. And I think it's one of those things, particularly and we're in the era of reconciliation again, where we talk a lot more about the government, the federal government especially, has been making a lot of commitments about implementing the Truth and Reconciliation, ready for calls to action, implementing the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, engaging much more in developing in co-creation, legislation, regulation, policy with First Nations and Métis people. We have Crown Accords with Assembly of First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Union and those set important framework and important context. So there's the opportunity is there. I think the political commitment, the political will is there, but then operationalizing some of those commitments can be challenging. I think it's fair to say, and I think a lot of people would find that in various sectors. You fight hard to get a political commitment or a political signal on any one of these issues, and Godspeed to you all. And that's great, but then getting a result. The commitment's not the result. That's kind of the beginning. It's you pick the marker up off the table and you try to cash it in the system, and that can be challenging. Even when the outcome is. I think the context for particularly where there's significant funds involved, as I say, is the accountability. And the accountability, different accountability bargains depending on the level of government and the flow of funds is challenging, and it's not terribly outcome focused. It's certainly focused on kind of outputs and use of funds. So I think that's kind of a challenge. I certainly there's a role for government. I just think the federal government needs to be prepared to assume different roles in different contexts. But it's got tremendous power and opportunity and resources. So there's no opinion.
Anyone else want to tackle that question?
Let's say, coming from moving from kind of the healthcare and health authority system best, and moving from there to nonprofit and realizing in public health how much the work of nonprofits and charities is appreciated, sometimes because of kind of political reasons why you're not able to perhaps put out everything you'd want to put out, but knowing that there is a group out there that you may be kind of explicitly or implicitly working with that is forwarding that cause is perhaps not a formal partnership, but I think a really good relationship. I think though it also speaks to what was mentioned earlier about kind of the downloading of social work to local community organizations that perhaps shouldn't be their role, but that's how it is now, given the lack of funding. So you do work very closely with those organizations, and it's been heartening in some ways because now moving in the nonprofit sector, I feel like it's sometimes very difficult to get your voice in that you have very good relationships with a number of different federal ministers and provincial representatives, but you don't feel like often it's being heard. And I keep thinking it is being heard because I know some of those conversations that have happened internally, and you know that is acknowledged, but it's that next step of having the good relationship be translated into actually what is the very concrete way in which we can work with you and what does that look like, that I'm hoping will happen, but I haven't had that yet, although we have had kind of smaller successes, if not in the kind of way that we'd like to have.
Next question. I have one ready, but we.
I want to hear these.
Hi everyone. I know a lot of people in the room, which is kind of weird. I think it's when it's talking about like 1970, it's almost 50 years ago, and it's like I was born in 1980, and I'm like, man, I'm almost 40. So thanks for the reminder. But question about I want Monika, first of all, everybody in this room is winging it. So don't feel like there's a level of expertise that you have to have. I'm saying that as someone who's just repurposed and reconfigured the charity, and last week my title changed from director to CEO, and we're all just winging it. So just hold there, and so are the people in government. So that's a different thing too. So and so that's just like we're all doing it so no one's trying to figure it out. But I want to talk about that notion of winging it for a bit. And I didn't realize coming here today that we'd be talking about Aki Energy. I spent a couple weeks ago, actually on Fisher River First Station, working with Darcy and Sean and the group from Aki. The work that I do at CCEDNet helps to bring people together to help identify some of these issues. And we're issue agnostic, but we're cause focused. So like we don't have to have a typical thing that we're working on. We're working with different actors. How we do things is sort of our MO and how we're doing it. So we were up there and I realized that like we're watching them install geothermal in community, and like the money, like the system is so broken that Manitoba Hydro will only pay for the equipment to do it, and it won't actually pay for the staff, just the capital costs. But you need people to install this stuff, and you need capacity and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, man, how do we figure this out? So we're working with a number of funders and partners, and we're winning it, like literally winning it in terms of trying to support Aki and other partners in that work. So this is a long-winded sort of comment about winging it. And tomorrow, people are going to be on the Hill talking about that, and that's like turning the Titanic. Like changing 400-year-old policy, that's like, we know what happens when we try to steer the Titanic and try to alter course, right? We know what happens. But how can we be winging it while that's happening? So that's important. The work tomorrow is so important. But how can we continue to wing it and just make shit happen in a context when we still have to do all of that? And is anyone having any success with just winging it? And then actually seeing some of that shit happen and not waiting for the policy shit to happen from government. So.
Winging it every day. No, I love what you have to say there. Like, I think we just have to find a way to get after it. I mean, we've been operating for 4 years now, and we're not a charity. I'm like, this is a huge barrier. Well, we're still doing it. We're still finding a way to do it because the work needs to happen. And there is so much inertia in the system. Like you say, like just on the geothermal example, which is classic, and that inertia is preventing us from tackling the, existential threats to our society like climate change. And it's imperative upon us to wing it. And at the same time, to be, to go to the Days on the Hill and that kind of thing and advocate really hardly that, like, this isn't the time to be stuck in a quagmire of inertia here. Like, this is important. Like, it's clear, we've talked about this for a long time about how Canada's charity laws in the 1800s, I don't think it's acceptable to keep just being like, oh, it's been like that for a long time. Like, we need to fix this shit.
And just because it snows where you live doesn't mean climate change isn't happening. I think there are a lot of sources of enterprise and inspiration. I think the sad truth, and I think about this, and I've been saying this for a long time, even when it was heretical, because I was a public servant probably for a lot of that time, is, again, the notion of risk, and who assumes the risk? I mean, as you would have seen yourself, Lee, in your experiences and your travels and your engagement with people, is that what greater risk is there than the living conditions in which many of our most vulnerable citizens find themselves? So I find this notion of some stakeholder, be it a taxpayer, and I love taxpayers, are somehow more important than a child in a community that doesn't have a lot of capacity and has seen their horizons dim through no fault of their own. Quite appalling, galling, but a great opportunity all at the same time. As you know, I had an experience in the Friendship Center movement. So 118 community-based Indigenous service organizations, all of them tap dancing and winging it every day. Many of them have become engaged in social enterprise as a necessity, either for funding or to get community members jobs, or other people who would otherwise have very challenging labor force attachment. So I think it is happening. I think it's always funny that when I worked in the federal public service, and there was a big championing of this very innovative approach to dealing with youth, and then to kind of stretch the limit on Treasury Board rules on that one. So. So that's a whole other question on can government innovate, and that's a separate panel. PhilanthroTHINK 2018, we'll tackle that one. But anyway, it's happening. It can happen more.
I don't necessarily when it comes to some of the interventions that we want to see and we need. I don't necessarily think we actually have to wing it. Communities know their problems and know their challenges, and the local community most likely knows what a solution is to that. So from the higher level up, it's just a matter of putting infrastructure in place that can bring those ideas to the surface, that can support those over a long generational change, and can backfill the local knowledge that is there. Put leadership into people's hands and communities, put the resources behind them, and they'll know the problems. They'll know the solutions for the problems. That's the one point I have to it. The other is keep winging it, but also this is human services. So if it's social services, if you screw up, there can be a significant downside that's not you, the person who put the thing in place. So a little caution around that. But then in support of that, the concern with these massive systems and fear of these massive systems, it's a bit weird for a straight white dude to be talking about confidence. It's a little disingenuous, right? Obviously my experience with that's going to be different than others. But all these systems are massively inequitable and have been forever. So they haven't been lunged or winged or whatever the task stands for. So I don't think we need to be all that concerned with being intimidated by systems that are enormously inequitable and have demonstrated themselves to be over that time.
As you were talking, it seems that most of my work as a family doc and public health has been in small communities, and I have found that to be one of the most kind of just heartening places to be, because you are so acutely aware of what people are doing and the exciting things that can happen at a local level. And admittedly, some of them might not have the big, broad impact that you might like to see, but they do have an impact and they bring people together. And it's that energy that I think informs some of the bigger policy work that people do want to do also. But you need to have those local, very concrete things happening in front of you to give you that motivation to say we can still change some of those bigger issues. And that's, I think, one of the things that I found that I love about working in small communities, because it gives, I shouldn't say it happens in big cities too, you develop that community, but I think it's just so in front of you. You work with these people every day in all kinds of different ways. And the other piece I was thinking about is, even with the big policy changes, those little steps along the way that keep you excited. And I was thinking about National Pharmacare as an example, which many people have been involved in for many years, and it's a very long, long road, but each year there's a little bit more that happens that just makes you think it can happen, so you keep going and going and going, and that is kind of a major government policy you're trying to change, but at least you feel like something's, or you need to believe that something is changing, and that otherwise I think none of us would be doing the work that we're doing.
Any other questions? Probably up here. Maybe time for 2 more questions.
Oh my gosh, I thought an hour and a half was so long.
Thank you. I was listening with a lot of attention and appreciation for all of your answers, to all your answers, and it's just, all of you have mentioned partnerships in some form or other at one point in your answers, and I was just wondering how you conceive of partnerships. And you mentioned not-for-profit organizations that created a for-profit, and so how do you see the future of partnerships for not-for-profit organizations or charitable organizations, whether it's with other such not-for-profit organizations or with private partners or government as a partner, maybe?
Yeah, so our future, if Canada doesn't magically update its charitable laws for the 21st century, could involve being a project of a charity, for instance. So, yeah, that's the best answer to that, is that, we're always kind of exploring that and looking at that as a possibility. And we also work much more collaboratively with other nonprofit news outlets, or not even nonprofit, just like in the kind of independent media space. Like typically, journalism has been a very competitive space, and you wouldn't catch like the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star working together. But we have content sharing agreements in place with the Tidy and the National Observer and the Huffington Post and so forth. So there's that kind of partnership as well.
Are you looking at me as if you want to say something?
No,
Looking at me so I can say something.
sorry.
Okay. Does anyone else?
I get excited about unusual partnerships. I like seeing and they're fraught with where they can go. But even on very small items, so part of my mandate has been reaching out quite a bit to the private sector, working with chambers. So on the one hand, I have pressure from the traditional left groups where see that as a huge issue of the problem. But then we're trying to fit that intersection in, or we're trying to fit in that spot of how we can make these local economies work to solve those impacts. And so going out and finding weird partners that you would never expect to be working with, but it turns out you have one item you both have a common goal on, and attempting to put something together to achieve that goal, you kind of shove the other 9 things aside for the brief while you're going there. And the amount of trust and interest that can bring forward, and the amount of new options for collaboration afterwards, that's what's got me most excited, is picking out the weird partners, the ones that are not expected, finding a piece to target on, and seeing what that can actually do for reciprocity and trust, and where that can go from there.
I think for our work, it's been essential because our purpose is to look at how these different policies and areas impact health, and we're not the experts in all of those areas. So if it's food security, if it's housing, if it's environmental issues, there are many organizations doing excellent work in those areas. So if it's not there, if we can bring that health focus, that's what we tend to do. I'm thinking of, we've been involved very much with living wage work in Saskatchewan, so that's been a really good example of the different unusual partnerships that come together. So we coordinate with a group of nonprofits and charities, but we work, of course, directly with for-profit businesses because they are the ones that will actually implement, the living wage. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely essential, especially when it's part of culture change and trying to link together these different sectors. You want to work with the ones that are doing the work.
Yeah, I think I would echo kind of all those pieces, and I would say that, you have to, as I opened with, in an Indigenous context, that you've got to be prepared to spend a much longer time than you anticipated building partnerships, building trust, and I think what Indigenous communities need is patient capital a lot of the time. there are some leaps that have to happen. So I think the partner that's focused on the relationship more than a specific outcome is going to be helpful.
Great. We have time for one more question.
You're getting kicked out, ready to walk, or?
Lights shut off, I think. No? Okay, well maybe this is a good place to end. No?
I would just like to say, invite you all to say a big thank you to our panelists. I have the pleasure of giving the thank yous. We heard really interesting discussion. I think one thing that really struck me was the use of co-creation. This idea that we always find new ways and interesting ways to collaborate, participate, make change happen, but we also have to focus. And I think tomorrow is a great opportunity for the sector to come as a whole, really the sector widely, and focus and really get things changed, better, improved. And I think today really spurred this conversation, so I really appreciate that. I want to say a big thank you to Brittany as well, so thank you so much for that. And so be on the lookout. We have these events on a regular basis called PhilanthroTHINK. And so if you are not already on our list, please approach us, give us your contact information, or just go online and register, and you'll be informed of all of our activities. Thank you so much again for coming.